So our next speaker is ZUHER JAZMATI, and again his paper is co-authored with Nina STUDER, that unfortunately is not here with us.
Thank you very much. I will present today a co-authored interdisciplinary paper examining the durability of Islamophobic stereotypes connected to men from the MENA region and their specific forms of manliness. I argue that contemporary European notions of Oriental manliness are strangely homogenized and static, and that they have a hidden colonial connotation. During the colonial past, the colonized Oriental manliness was constructed as being the primitive counterpart to an idealized European masculinity. The significant characteristics of Oriental manliness as defined in the 19th century were still essentially the same in the 1960s, when Frantz Fanon wrote that his contemporaries had solidified but not founded the idea of North African man as, quote, born slackers, born liars, born thieves, born criminals. We would like to argue in many ways these same pejorative characteristics still define Oriental manliness today. This can be seen in the fact that the events in Cologne on New Year's Eve 2015 went viral worldwide. Right-wing groups felt vindicated. The public discourse seemed to confirm their narrative of North African man, sexually uncontrolled and potentially uncontrollable man. A lot of the media coverage following the events in Cologne overlapped with right-wing and colonial notions of wild North African men who only come to Europe in order to sexually harass the white female body. After Cologne, this anxiety focused not only on women in Germany, but Europe in general, as I will show later. In order to analyze this alleged durability of stereotypes about Oriental manliness, we propose to divide our paper into a historical part, which will give a short overview over the formulaic metaphors, images and knowledge production of colonized Oriental manliness, and a contemporary part which will trace the harmful longevity of these colonial stereotypes from the 19th century to the sensationalist reports following the incidents in Cologne. In this second part, we will use pictures from German and other European public media which covered the incidents in Cologne and analyze how they reproduce the long-standing anti-Muslim racist stereotypical image of and knowledge on the North African masculine subject. The shocking imagery used in the media after the incidents of Cologne was very familiar to us as an intersectional historian focusing on the colonized Maghreb, but we also realized that most readers, and probably also most of the journalists, putting together these sensationalist reports were probably not truly aware of the colonial heritage hidden in these pictures, which will be analyzed in detail in the second part of the presentation. Hands of man of color grabbing at a naked white female body. It is simply impossible for pictures such as these to be seen detached from their historical context. Most authors, like Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, pointed out that there had once been a high level of civilization in the region, in the MENA region, that generated under the influence of Islam. North Africans were, as the colonial authors saw it, essentially stuck in the Middle Ages, a notion that is still very present in contemporary coverage on the region. Male North African violence, on the other hand, was seen to be an inherited, shared, and deeply primitive character trait, which meant that every North African man was perceived to potentially be a hereditary, uncontrollable aggressor towards all around him. The danger posed by such man was perceived to be at once physical and psychological, as it was often assumed that North African man possessed a more aggressive, if also more primitive, virility than the French. French fear of North African man was channeled through the image of the Algerian with a knife, the North African man who murdered good French settlers, and also other Africans, especially North African women, in a fit of. This male propensity towards violence was usually explained through both the lack of control and the lack of moderation that was, in the eyes of most French observers, intrinsic to North Africans. It was thus believed that situations in which a French man would have been able to remain in control of his emotions turned into tragedies when it involved a North African man. The psychiatrist Antoine Porot and his student Doncom Arli described this fear of an uncontrollable male North African violence in an article on criminal impulsivity in the Algerian Native in 1932. Oh, sorry, that's, I think, the wrong... Oh. No, sorry. I think, okay, it's the original quote, but I will translate it in, in French, but I will translate it in English. So, quote, "More modestly, we would like to research the reason of a phenomenon which is truly particular to this race. The frequency of criminal impulsivity. The considerable proportion of attacks in the judicial statistics is striking, and we can say that 9/10 of the court cases of expertise concerning the criminal responsibility of native entrusted the psychiatrists relate to murders or attempted murders. The native plays with the baton, with the knife, or with guns with an easiness, a promptitude, and a savagery which often led to death. It is very often close relatives, father, mother, brother, and especially wife, who are struck, and in a certain number of cases that are several victims of the impulsive fury of the murderer." So within the colonial discourse about North African masculinity, the much feared North African man violence was often strangely sexualized in vocabulary, metaphors, and the context it was put into. Among other things, French colonial authors often focused on the sexual violence perpetrated by North African men against North African women, and also other North African men. The French doctor and criminologist Adolphe Cochet, for example, stated in 1883, "We do not want to excuse the action of the Arab, but we can only point out that what is to us a monstrous crime is to him a very natural action, such as rape within a marriage with all its brutalities, to cite only one example." So this idea of sexual violence being something completely normal, something intrinsic to North African manliness, even was seen to be one of the main markers of difference between colonizers and colonized. This conviction of the existence of a North African propensity towards sexual violence obviously colored French perceptions of North African behavior towards the French. So I'd like to argue that the embodiment of French fear in North Africa was, even more than the Algerian with a knife, the image of an animal-like Muslim man attacking, kidnapping, enslaving, and/or raping a pure, innocent French woman, even if this fear was not often explicitly written about in source material. The need, however, to protect good European women from contact with North African men and thus from this form of violence was a driving motivation of the architecture of the French colonial project in North Africa. This conviction and the consequential need to protect European women at all costs from North African men were in line with what are called black peril panics in other African colonial contexts. Sporadic outbreaks of panic about men of color raping white women. Tellingly, it was not actual cases of interracial rape that sparked black peril outrages, but fear of both such events and their outcomes that has to be seen in the context of the widespread racial prejudice of the time, which allowed European men to have some kinds of sexual intercourse with North African women, but constructed all potential sexual contact between North African men and European women as necessarily the result of sexual violence. So this image of North African virility being intrinsically violent survived long into the 20th century and also found its way across the Mediterranean. Being first written about by travelers and settlers, these notions were taken up by medical legal experts who justified them by translating them into a scientific vocabulary in the first half of the 20th century. Frantz Fanon argued that notions of Muslim manliness were not created but solidified by the writings of what is commonly called the École d'Alger, the neuropsychiatric University of Algiers, that under the leadership of the psychiatrist Antoine Porot, whom I have mentioned above. The École d'Alger dominated the French psychiatric discourse in the first half of the 20th century, and their theories about pathology and normality of North Africans spread far beyond just an expert audience. Their theories, which, as I mentioned above, had taken up many settler ideas, were read by much broader audience and thus had a profound influence on the image of the French of North Africans broader both in North Africa and in France. Many historians have argued that these basic assumptions of the École d'Alger about North African men linking immoderation and lack of control with sexuality, violence, and general deviancy, creating the theory of an inherent criminal impulsivity in North African men, still heavily influence our contemporary perceptions, as, for example, the historian and psychiatrist Robert Berthellier in a 2006 article on Fanon. As mentioned above, we think that the colonial heritage of this can be seen very well in the media reaction to the events in Cologne. So for the following paper, 3 cover pictures of different magazines and newspapers that depict the events of Cologne are going to be used and analyzed. The German weekly magazine Focus is one of the best known newspapers in Germany and is considered to be politically right-centered medium. The magazine has a readership of 5.9 million all over Germany. Thus, one can classify Focus as one of Germany's most influential political medial opinion leaders. So the cover picture of this magazine represents a naked, white, slim, blonde woman She holds her right arm in front of her breast and her left hand to cover her vulva. The face ends above the nose, not showing the woman's eyes, while her mouth is half open. Her body has multiple dark imprints of hands on her naked body. The photo of the woman is black and white, while a red bar goes through the body. With white grand letters on the red bar on the level of the woman's breast, the headline of the magazine says, "Women Accuse." On a second smaller bar, the subheading of the title says, "After the sex attacks of migrants." A third red bar on the level of the woman's vulva, the last subheading, asks the question, "Are we still tolerant or already blind?" Over her right shoulder, a headline says, "Exclusive, what really happened on New Year's Eve in Cologne." The complete picture takes about 4/5 of the magazine cover. The three red bars that go every which way through the cover picture remind us of a crime scene protection tape. The woman is surrounded by the tape while she, in black and white, represents the victim of a crime. The criminal act, the event of New Year's Eve, is focused on the body of the woman. As Lalonde Sander analyzes the picture from a critical feminist approach, she writes, quote, "Not only is the woman naked, but her vulnerability is eroticized, her mouth is slightly opened. That is especially bitter as the title in itself therefore rips off the clothes of the woman." And the Focus magazine is very famous for its very eroticizing, sexist, naked women cover pictures. So it's nothing new, actually. The woman's white, pure and teasing body appears contradictive to the black, dirty male hands on her body. The assumed racial component of the picture is supported by combining the photo with the text on the illustration. The allegedly liberal society is made responsible for the attacks on New Year's Eve by the accusing question, "After the sex attacks of migrants, are we still tolerant or already blind?" It can be assumed that the magazine makes an implicit connection between migrants and the so-called sex attacks. The question implies that the magazine already knew about this connection before and that the rape attacks were consequently predictable. Anyone who is not blind should have known that attacks like these would eventually happen. The liberal and blind ones are made responsible for the attacks. The magazine does not speak of rapists, but creates a collective guilt by generally speaking of migrants. This link appears almost to be a natural conclusion, which clearly gives the cover picture a racist notion. The text-image link makes the perpetrators into a homogeneous perpetrator group. Thus, the perpetrators are defined as the other, migrants, and sexism and sexual violence is culturalized and even racialized. The next cover image on the attacks on New Year's Eve in Cologne was published by the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is seen as a center-left, liberal, whatsoever, a daily magazine. The inner frame of the female body it has a readership of 1.48 million readers every day. So it is one of Germany's most read newspapers on a daily basis. So the image shows a black background on the lower part of a female body in white in the middle of the picture. The inner frames of the female body are contoured through a black right arm that is about to touch the genital part of the woman. The outer part of the body is framed through the rest of the black background. The image plays with basically two classic racist stereotypes. Firstly, we observe the black hand that is touching the vulva of the white female body. The white body appears to be pure, innocent, and inactive, while the black arm is actively grabbing. The arm represents a danger for the white body that needs to be protected. The old tradition of that colonial image seems obvious. The racist stereotype image of the sexually uncontrollable, wild, irrational black man is still vivid on a cover picture in Germany 2016. The second message of the picture is less clear, but is a logical consequence of how the colors of the cover picture interact with the social realities. The black hand is of the same color as the background, black. It could therefore be assumed from the picture that black people are a majority in a German society. The many refugees who arrived in October 2015 in Germany were permanently named as refugee waves in the popular discourse. So blackness on the picture is everywhere, but stands out. But what stands out, therefore, what seems to be a minority, is the endangered white body. It is another colonial image that is played with by giving the white body a subject and the black body an object status. The threatening blackness around the white body calls the observer of the image to action. In order to protect the white body of the the blackness needs to be decreased. The perpetrator group again is homogenized and even majoritized, while at the same time the public media debate focused on consequences that concerned the homogenized group, deportation as well as the tightening of the asylum law. The last picture. My Polish is not so well. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I don't speak Polish. Wiezieci maybe, which also talked about the events on Cologne. As this event became a topic globally, it was also important to take. We thought that it's also important to take into consideration non-German medium. In order to analyze how this topic was talked about there. So the image shows a white woman on the foreground of the picture. The background is gray and appears irrelevant. She wears the European flag over her left shoulder, implying that it was taken violently off her right side. 6 brown, hairy male hands grab the woman violently from all sides. She is surrounded by hands and by their sexual touches. 2 hands grab both of her hands. One hand tries to take off the rest of her dress, which clearly symbolizes Europe. 2 hands touch her around her hips, and 1 hand pulls her behind by her head in front of the right side of her shoulder. And the title of the magazine says Islamic Violence in Europe. The blonde woman that is being attacked by 6 brown hands visualizes that the attacks in Cologne are more than just attacks in one particular city on that specific day. As a woman wears a dress of the European flag, it was an attack on the entire European Union. Religious and long-standing values are being infiltrated and even destroyed by violent brown men. The brown men, who according to the title in this case are Muslims, are foreign bodies from outside of Europe. With their violent behavior and dark-colored skin, they appear as non-compatible to Europe and are therefore not belonging there. The racist imagery on the cover picture gives Europe a face, an expression, a feeling, whereas Muslims are reduced to violent, grabbing, sexist arms who harass and attack the former. The pained and scared scream of the blonde female European victim urges the observer to act and do something against Muslim refugees in Europe. So as a conclusion, we can say that the covers discussed in this presentation are the present-day equivalent of Black Peril, tales whispered to each other in settler colonies. They are the equivalent of colonial psychiatries diagnosing the non-patient majority of North African men as compulsive, violent criminals. They are the equivalent of the settler morality decreeing that all sexuality between North African men and European women necessarily must be the result of violence. The prejudice against North African men, which was formed and cultivated during the colonization of the region, was expressed in the media reaction to the attacks on New Year's Eve in Cologne in a very specific way. The hegemonic masculinity in the post-Cologne context is still the idealized, controlled European man, one that would never stoop to grab at a naked female body, but one that points this behavior out as foreign, unacceptable, and the immigrant man condemned as a whole on the covers of newspapers are still seen to conform with colonial prejudice about a Oriental masculinity. They are still depicted as the same barbaric masses of potential criminals that the colonial settlers protected their brown women from. The pictures were spread through the right-wing blogs and websites. The slogan "Refugees, not welcome" became a symbol of right demonstrations and parties in Germany. The pure reduction of refugees, migrants, or Muslims to the violent sexist attackers is dangerous and reproduces old colonial images. The shift of everyday sexism to a phenomena that can specially be observed in refugees is dangerous on many layers. On the one side, sexism is trivialized as it becomes a topic for only one specific event. The reality is that in the year 2015, 331 women, so nearly every day, were murdered by their partners in Germany. On the other side, sexism is viewed as a stronger problem of the others. Women become a plaything of right nationalists to legitimize and support their racist ideas of the outside non-white group. That is a colonial tradition that can still be observed today. This discourse about Oriental masculinity, be it in the colonial context or in the post-Cologne media landscape, is based on a very classic fear of the other as dangerous and violent and primitive. But it also shows the underlying assumption that the primitive other, both the colonized and the immigrant North African, is, in a way, hypermasculine. More aggressive than a European man, especially more sexually aggressive, more dominant maybe even. Thank you.
Our third paper is a comparative analysis of European Islamophobia. And as you can see, we're already crossing borders. So we welcome Engy Abdelkader to present the last paper of this panel.
Good morning. So as you heard, my name is Engy Abdelkader, and I'm based in the United States at Georgetown University. At Georgetown University, I work with the Bridge Initiative, which is a research project focused on Islamophobia. My research and writing interests lie at the intersection of religion, law, and society, and I generally focus on bigotry and discrimination confronted by Muslim minority communities in the United States, but also in diverse geographical areas, including parts of Europe, I've also written about China, Burma, and the experience of Muslims in the Central African Republic. In doing that, it becomes difficult to ignore the fact that Islamophobia manifests in gradations, which assume both a qualitative as well as quantitative aspect. So for example, in the United States, Islamophobia often manifests in the context of social hostilities emanating typically from individuals, but also sometimes from groups and organizations, as opposed to government-sanctioned official restrictions on free exercise of religion, which is actually protected by the US Constitution, which not only represents a source of law, but also national values for our country. So to give you an example of social hostilities and trends that are occurring in the American context, and both the qualitative and quantitative aspects of Islamophobia in the United States, there are three prominent trends and challenges confronting Muslims in the United States. First is increasing hate crimes. We currently find ourselves in a time where violence is inflicted upon Muslim men, women, and youth at increasing rates. According to statistics, there are more acts of anti-Muslim hate crimes occurring now than any other time since the September 11 terrorist attacks more than 15 years ago. In fact, according to most recent government-issued statistics, there's been a 67% increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes in 2015, notwithstanding the fact that there has not been a comparable act of terrorism to the September terrorist attacks, which was characterized in our own history as being the most traumatic and severe in the United States. In addition to hate crimes, there has also been a marked increase in discrimination in workplace experienced by Muslim Americans. So again, according to government statistics, in the year 2015, last year, Muslim Americans were responsible for filing 40% of all religious discrimination claims in the employment context. To put that in proper perspective, first, we need to keep in mind that the community only represents 1 to 2% of the entire population. So while the community represents 1 to 2% of the entire US population, it accounts for 40% of all religious discrimination claims in the United States. For further perspective, in 2009, the Muslim community was responsible for 25% of all employment discrimination cases. So we're looking at an increase from 25% in 2009 to 40% in 2015. So employment discrimination is also on the rise. And it's important to keep in mind that these numbers are not necessarily comprehensive. A lot of discrimination remains unreported, whether we are analyzing the incidence of hate crimes perpetrated against Muslims or perceived Muslims, or whether we're talking about discrimination in the workplace. A third prominent trend in social hostilities confronting Muslim Americans proves to be what we often refer to as bias-based bullying in schools as well as university campuses. During the presidential election cycle, which captured international attention, there was a report of increased anti-Muslim sentiment in one of 3 public school classrooms around the country. These incidents of bullying are becoming increasingly more violent and also perpetrated and inflicted upon victims more who are younger in age. So just recently we had a case that arose in the United States involving a 5-year-old boy who was physically assaulted by a group of peers in school who also ranged in the ages of 5 to 6 years of age. This is not necessarily an anomaly, but I would say an increasing trend. So in that analysis, you saw both qualitative and quantitative aspects of Islamophobia in the United States. First, they're generally occurring in the context of social hostilities, qualitative. Second, there are 3 prominent trends: hate crimes, bias-based bullying, employment discrimination, qualitative. But also when we look specifically at statistics, oftentimes issued by government sources, we're seeing increasing rates of discrimination and bigotry experienced by Muslim Americans. As I mentioned, oftentimes the discrimination is not necessarily in the form of official restrictions. It's worth noting that this may change with the incoming administration, where President-elect Trump will have power and has actually articulated policies that will be targeting Americans on account of their religion specifically. It also bears noting that while in accordance with our federal and oftentimes state laws, it is illegal and unconstitutional to single out Americans on account of their religion, and this is in some distinction to parts of Europe. There's still the reality of government policies and practices having a chilling effect on religious practices. So to give an example of this, since the September 11th terrorist attacks, there has been evidence that both local, state, and federal government officials engage in both racial and religious profiling tactics when it comes to counterterrorism investigations. And so while this practice does not necessarily translate into a law that prohibits Muslims from giving charity, or prohibits Muslims from wearing the hijab, or prohibits Muslims from engaging in their local student associations that identify as Islamic in universities or high schools or whatnot. It may have the consequence of inhibiting those sorts of practices. So in the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks, when we see a crackdown on charities that are largely Islamic or Muslim in nature, it has the consequence of preventing or averting charitable donations to Islamic causes. When we see the practice of law enforcement officials exclusively focusing their resources and attention on mosques, we see the consequence of Muslims who do not want to go to the mosque so that they're not caught up in a dragnet by federal, local, or state officials. And so I think that it's important for me to just make that note when I mention social hostilities versus official restrictions. So in looking at Islamophobia in various geographical regions, whether the United States, Europe, Burma, or the Central African Republic, I see value in understanding the way the phenomenon manifests in different contexts, at different times, and the way it impacts different segments of the Muslim community. Oftentimes in the United States, Muslim publics they don't necessarily recognize the relevance of the experience of Muslims in parts of Europe or in China or even the Central African Republic. Understandably, they focus almost exclusively on the American experience with anti-Muslim discrimination and bigotry. And while I can understand that on different levels, I do think it's somewhat short-sighted because I think there's something to be learned about the way Islamophobia manifests within institutional contexts, among individuals and groups when we actually engage in a comparative analysis. So with respect to my instant inquiry for the purposes of this conference, what I did is actually look at Islamophobia in 5 European countries: France, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden. I began with an analysis of public opinion polling data, also examined social, economic, and political developments and its relationship to anti-Muslim discrimination and bigotry, explored what laws, at least in theory, protect religious freedom, including what would be Muslims, as well as the intersection of law, religion, and society, and how that often culminates in discrimination against Muslims in the European context. Rather than read through or even summarize each of these sections for you, I'd encourage you to look at the paper which has been published at UCLA Law School in the United States and is available online. What I'll do in the time that I have remaining is just highlight several findings that I thought were somewhat counterintuitive and perhaps surprising. First, with respect to public opinion polling, those of you who have looked at the experience of Muslims in Europe will not be surprised to learn that across the 5 different countries that I examined, there's a general consensus among European publics that Islam is a violent religion and that the faith is incompatible with what is oftentimes characterized as European values. There are strong majorities that support both those contentions, and that's pretty consistent across those 5 countries. What was counterintuitive, however, was a finding in 2015, last year, in both France and the United Kingdom, where strong majorities, over 70% of those who responded to the surveys that were distributed by Pew Research Center, which is based in the United States, actually held a favorable view of Islam. So in 2015, according to research published by the Pew Research Center, publics in the UK and in France, over 70%, expressed a favorable view of Islam. This seems counterintuitive, particularly in the French context, because there were at least 2 very high-profile acts of terrorism that occurred in France in 2015. And yet, according to this research, the respondents expressed a favorable view of Islam. And so one possible explanation for this would be the response of the Muslim community itself to these acts of terrorism, specifically in response to the attack on the offices of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. There was an international response by Muslims condemning the action, attempting to create a psychological space between that event and the faith, as well as the faith community itself. We also saw a mobilization of Muslims on new media, specifically Twitter, where there was a concerted effort to sympathize and express that sympathy towards the victims and the families of victims, as well as expressing solidarity with the greater French public. And in addition, specifically in the context of Charlie Hebdo, we saw that there were prominent roles played by at least 2 Muslim men who actually worked to save the lives of victims or potential victims that were targeted by the perpetrators. One of those Muslim men actually lost his own life doing so. And so it is possible that these various actions served as sort of an organic counter-narrative in that context to challenge any negative perceptions that may have arisen from that terrorist event. Right? Similarly, in the UK, what we saw in 2015 were 2 notable, again, sort of organic developments involving prominent Muslim Americans. Most recently was the ascension of Sadiq Khan to the position of mayor of London, which was not only historic for Britons, but made international news headlines as well, including the United States. Shortly before that, Nazia Hussain sort of won over British hearts and minds, including high-profile individuals such as former British Prime Minister David Cameron, by prevailing in the Great British Bake Off. Interestingly, even though this is a reality TV show and contest, it attracted both a lot of attention within the national context of the UK, but around the world. Right? And so you have this this European Muslim who is wearing a headscarf, who actually gained popularity and, in some sense, approval among her fellow compatriots in her country, notwithstanding the fact that she remained identified with Islam. Right? And so again, these are organic counter-narratives to stereotypes about Muslims as well as Islam, and they may help to account for this favorable viewing of the Islamic faith more generally, at least in 2015. So that certainly was counterintuitive. A second counterintuitive finding in the context of this inquiry was also the role of international events and how they may or may not contribute to Islamophobia. Typically, we often associate upticks in manifestations of Islamophobia with acts, either real or perceived, of terrorism, either domestically or internationally. And so if there is a terrorist attack, oftentimes that is followed by an uptick of hate crimes against both Muslims and Muslim institutions. And that's a common association, I think, that's made in both the public mind and beyond. Interestingly, another international development which seems to have contributed to Islamophobia in the past year or so is the so-called refugee crisis. Increasingly, the influx of immigrants who are perceived as being majority Muslims in European countries has actually triggered increased Islamophobia, both in terms of the rhetoric that we hear from political officials and high-profile individuals, as well as acts of discrimination and bigotry, such as hate crimes. And one notable example of this is actually within the public opinion polling itself. So again, looking at public opinion data from Pew Research Center from this past year in 2015, it found that in France, 46% of the respondents reported an increased fear of terrorism tied directly to the arrival of refugees in the French context. So there's an association. We accept more refugees in our country, there's more of a likelihood of terrorism happening here. 53% of French respondents expressed the fear that the refugees would actually take away French jobs. The fear is actually irrational insofar as research data has long shown that individuals who are immigrants and non-European, and moreover who come from African or Middle Eastern backgrounds, suffer almost very high levels of discrimination. They are 4 times as likely to be passed over for jobs than their white Christian counterparts. This is a consistent trend throughout various parts of Europe. So the fact that there is a fear that the refugees will actually steal jobs is not grounded in fact. It's rather irrational. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, 52% of respondents associated refugees with terrorism, indicating that the arrival of refugees in the UK would result in an increased likelihood of terrorism occurring within the country. Similarly, 46% indicated that the refugees will take away jobs from those who are already there. So these public opinion data already sort of shows the manifestation of Islamophobia as it relates to the question of the refugees and the crisis that's perceived. There's also the social and political responses. Let's say, for example, in Germany, in 2015, Germany absorbed 1 million immigrants, and the majority were actually refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In response to that development, what we saw in Germany were anti-Muslim marches that attracted as many as 17,000 supporters. Anti-immigrant political parties intensifying in support and anti-Muslim rhetoric. Pervasive hostility towards Muslims, again, according to the public research data, and interestingly, the anti-Muslim sentiment that was detected transcended education, income, and political affiliation in Germany. So it did not matter whether an individual had a high school degree or a college degree or an advanced degree. It did not matter what political party they affiliated with. It did not matter how much money they made. Across the board, there was a consensus, and that consensus is that Muslims and Islam represent a threat in Germany. Finally, in a German context, and specifically in response to this increase in immigration, influx of immigrants to the country, we also saw an increased violence inflicted upon these individuals as well as institutions affiliated with them. So specifically in Germany during the year 2015, there are 1,000 hate crimes, violent attacks targeting asylum shelters. This is compared to less than 200 the year prior. So that's quite an increase in the actual violence. Finally, the third finding, which is not necessarily new, but just a point that I would like to signify, relates to hate crimes and the disproportionate impact that it has specifically on European Muslim women and those who choose to identify outwardly as being Muslims by wearing the Islamic headscarf or hijab. It's not necessarily new that we know that oftentimes these women are in fact victimized in acts and threats of violence across these countries. In fact, as many of you are probably aware, the European Network Against Racism published a report recently, Forgotten Women, that helps sort of expose the multiple forms of discrimination that Muslim women in Europe oftentimes confront. What I did want to emphasize in this context, though, is that I would say often in academia as well as in the public mind, when we speak of anti-Muslim hate crimes and the disproportionate impact that it may have on women, we do so through the lens of religion. So we characterize those hate crimes as anti-Muslim hate crimes, and sometimes to the exclusion of the identity of the individuals as women, as well as their ethnic and racial identities as well. The reason I mention it is because I think it's important to understand the intersectionality and how these women are uniquely impacted by discrimination, not only because of their religious identity, but also because of their gender, racial, and other aspects of their identity. And this is most evident when we look at the language that is used by the perpetrators at the time of the crime itself. So a very straightforward example would be an incident where a Muslim woman wearing hijab is attacked and the perpetrator physically assaulted. And the perpetrator at that time makes an utterance such as, "You terrorist," B-I-T-C-H, right? So the use of the word terrorist arguably is in reference to her religious identity, perhaps her racial identity, but certainly religion insofar as there is a strong association in the public mind between Islam and terrorism and violence. But the fact that the perpetrator also referred to her as a B-I-T-C-H also reveals his awareness of her gender, because men are generally not referred to with that slur. That's generally a slur that's used against women almost exclusively. So that also reveals his awareness of the fact that she's a woman. So again, I say that to just emphasize the various aspects of these victims' identity. And I think that's also important in terms of widening the scope of relevance, that these inquiries are not just relevant to individuals who may have an interest in the intersection of religion, law, and society, but also arguably to women's rights advocates. Thank you.
Fascinating panel. Let's open the floor for comments and discussion. Questions? Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. My question is for Dr. Al-Sheikh. In the strategies you presented, I was wondering if you might share with us your thoughts about the limitations of electoral politics in the U.S. context, only because historically we saw, for instance, the anti-war movement or the immigrant rights movement throw its weight behind, for instance, Obama, and then when he was successful in his elections, those movements effectively neutralized. And so what are some of the pitfalls of focusing on electoral organizing to the expense perhaps of the other strategies you mentioned, like grassroots or transnational organizing?
Thank you. That's I know the electoral politics strategy is extremely weak in the context of the U.S. and oftentimes it's been held hostage by the board or political elite in Washington, D.C. But I think what, in my own kind of opinion, and I think most of the Hassan Institute, we've been having a conversation around a strategy for a long period of time to uphold certain gains for the most marginalized group in the United States, electoral politics plus court politics, because the United States, as you might know, is a court-centered system, is very important. But you cannot win enough without a powerful social movement that demands a change. So in the case of ascendancy of Barack Obama, it will never happen if it wasn't a movement in the ground thirsty for social change. Social change that to depart from certain past of the United States troubling past. However, by virtue of the matter, to put somebody in the White House or in the state legislation and you go home, that's when you get defeated again. So our thinking is it has to be simultaneously, and you have to use what available tools for you at the moment. If you ask me personally, I do not like to live in a capitalist system, but there is no other place in the world to go. So I have to operate within this system, utilize the weakest point in the system in order over time to turn it around. I cannot dismantle it in one day. Racism is rampant in the United States. I might disagree with some people. It's extremely implicit, not explicit in the law, but unbelievable is not a safe place for people of color in the United States in certain states. In other states where I live and some of us work, is extremely pleasant to be. So the thing is, generalization is not helpful. And I agree with you, electoral politics alone is not gonna get us what we want to be as people who are defending our constitutional rights and civil liberties. We have to espouse them with other grassroots social movement mobilization. However, grassroots movement mobilization on Islamic issues will never win unless Muslims themselves supported the other struggles. We cannot argue for and asking American people to be with us. For example, the black community in the United States, and most of, and this is, I just gonna put it out there, and I welcome that most of Muslims in the United States are embodiment of racial biases. So how we can do that? And I think that's another place as well. So we have to deal with our double consciousness, as Dr. Bazian mentioned in one of his articles this year or last year. We have to work so hard internally and externally. We can't do it one way, and we cannot ask people to be in solidarity with us while we are completely absent from their struggles. So this both ways will help to change the perceptions, because I agree with you, is most of the time it's not the facts that govern our relationship, it's the perceptions, complete perceptions. And we have that evidence either qualitatively or quantitatively. So the point is you have to be present at the struggle of the others in order for the others to see you and to be in your struggles. And when we unify that space, social movement, I think the social movement will be powerful enough to demand change. Power never accept change unless it comes from source of power. But also to ignore electoral politics, you drop an easy path for at least protecting the most vulnerable at the moment of the attack, as how we live it currently, whether in both sides of the Atlantic. There is people extremely vulnerable, and we need to protect them. And the way to do that is you have to use constitutional rights, legal system, and electoral politics. But for long-term change, you need social movement.
Thank you. Yes.
Just a question. Okay?
Yeah.
Sorry. With your analysis of the imagery that you were taking, is it purely yourself and your colleagues that are analysing the imagery, or are you using a kind of greater pool of evaluation? Were you looking at general public's interpretation of the imagery as well? Just from a kind of devil's advocate kind of standpoint, if you're looking at those images with that kind of lens on of is this a representation of Islamophobia, you will undoubtedly see it that way. Now, obviously, it's quite clear in the imagery, but just from that kind of devil's advocate point of view, what kind of what's the word? Kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Have you got kind of built in another mechanism to make sure that is how you interpret those images? Control.
The method, you mean?
Essentially, yeah.
Ah, okay, yeah. I didn't want to bore you with my method in the presentation. Yeah, basically it's not our own personal interpretation of these images, but it is a very accepted method in art sciences and media sciences of the iconology, which is a method basically taking into consideration colors, taking into consideration the text, word, image linkings, and looking at how basically pictures are taken. So, for example, if we look at pictures of the Time magazine of Afghani women and how they were presented with that image of the woman with the cut nose and the headline, "What happens if we leave?" Then it's pretty clear that there is a message behind it, and that this can also be analyzed with a humanistic political science approach, interdisciplinary with art sciences and media sciences, looking at which colors are used. Is this picture taken at the same level as the photograph, or from below, from up, and so on? And all these, all of these issues are taken into consideration for the analysis. You can look at it in the paper afterwards. It's interesting, but for a presentation, maybe a bit boring.
Aziza?
I have a question for Zuhair. Also, in colonial discourse, the Muslim man was represented not only as hypersexually aggressive, but also penetrable, both politically and sexually. And so Jasper Poor argues that in the era of the War on Terror, the Muslim terrorist is also a queer figure. So I'm wondering if in maybe not these three images that you presented to us, but in other parts of the image archive around the Cologne incident, we also see this sort of tension in representation between the Muslim man as sexual aggressor as well as penetrable and queer.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, both of these images were, well, they were fluid during the colonial periods, and always changed, and always standing in relation with how basically the social situation or socio-political situation in Europe was, right? I mean, we have these interesting analysis of how masculinity and manliness always changed according to how manliness and masculinity changed in Europe as well, right? So it was always like an influential influential thing between the colonial region and the colonizer. There probably you have heard of desiring Arabs, right? I mean, there is these, which it could be seen as a little bit problematic, this book, but it is very, very important and very interesting for colonial manliness studies, as it really shows how quickly perceptions change and how radical they change, right? And in the end, and now, the perception that is very dominant in Europe and also in the US, I guess, is the one of not the of the passive, penetrable Muslim, but more of the active, violent one, which was not always the case, this perception, but which basically fits very much in this discourse of this Islamophobic discourse of the Muslims being the ones who want to angrily control the world and dominate everything on the world and Islamize everyone, which is interesting, right? Because it is very similar, if we look at anti-Semitist discourses, it is very similar of how Jews were seen, of the ones who want actively to dominate the world, and now we have in Germany this movement called Pegida, which stands for Patriots, Patriotic Europeans, against the Islamization of the Occident, basically the Islamization of the Occident, right? So the Muslims who want to take over everyone, so the ones not being the passive ones and the easy to victimize or easy to dominate, but the ones who are dominating the West easily.
Hatem?
Just on the question of methodology, the fact that you could create your own methodology should not be an apology, because that's one way to break the hegemonic discourse of methodologies that are vested in already a racialized construction. So that's one way to create a new terrain. Most subalterns have to create their own methodology to challenge the dominant. And the fact that Islamophobia itself as a term is being constantly problematized by those who want to assert that they have the right to be Islamophobic and there's no such thing as Islamophobia, which is a contradiction, but that's aside. The other terms, in terms of the electoral process, again, we failed to recognize that even in this current period in the US with the election of Trump, that the majority actually did not line up with him. In terms of the voting population, Clinton has 2.5 million more votes. It just, at least from those on the Democratic Party, they did not strategize correctly for the Electoral College. And we had at least a failure in strategy at the Democratic side. But I would argue that the Democratic Party have reached a tipping point by embracing the Muslim as the counter narrative to the Republican. And whether that's going to be consolidated moving forward with the possible selection of Keith Ellison as the Democratic Party chair, or they're going to bring somebody from the center-right of the Democratic Party, which is the Clinton machine, that would be a site to see if that direction continues. My argument that the tipping point was reached in relation to the shift, and we have a political party that's beginning to adopt that change. And that's why at least New York and California are different in the sense because the Democratic Party is shifting in that direction.
It's actually also, right, Islamophobia not being accepted and gender studies also not being accepted. If you do both, you're very,
actually,
have a very bad role.
The last one, it'll be interesting to bring in the photos from Abu Ghraib, in relations to the sexuality of the Muslim subject and superimpose it in relations to the current photograph. And I think it would be it would create that continuum.
Interesting.
Because Florida does something similar
Yeah.
to that, right?
In France, just to say something about what your really interesting presentation. In France, the controversy was mainly about the accountability of left-wing and feminists in what happened in Colonia, because they really put the blame on these people who are in a way weak because they don't want to recognize, and they are denying that the refugees are and just racialized men are a threat, the main threat against women and also against white civilization. So I felt that was really interesting to see the links between what happened in Germany and how the media covered it, and how that was perceived in France by French media and politicians. And I had also another point about what you said with the electoral issue, and that was really interesting because I am rereading the book Malcolm X Speaks and the Ballad of the Bullet, and I was like, 50 years later we are exactly in the same situation. And I mean, he was already highlighting the importance of having a good coalition and union between black people and the Bandung thing. He also was talking about it 50 years ago and saying that we should do it between racialized people. But I feel like we are still stuck in the same situation. So I don't know. So if you have any other kind of reflection and ideas of how we could make it, I would be delighted to hear it.
No, you are absolutely right. I think there is in the United States, there is a trend that we've been seeing, and a trend that's oftentimes progressive win, implement, and probably less than 5 decades, they lose, and the new generation redo the same thing again and again. In the right, it's completely the other way around. They build, they win, they accumulate. So there is always a step further. If you look in the United States 1920s and 30s, the progressive politics of FDR, for example, we lost them all in the next 60 years, and now we try to rebuild them again, even though they have a problem with it as a racialized public policy. But in their context, was extremely progressive, pro-poor, anti-corporate, more inclusive for the dominant group, the poor ones. But now we try to do at least those with inclusion of some people of color, right? So they're always the progressive because they don't have a vanguard, I think, in my opinion. They don't have a political party that is accountable to them. The Democratic Party always exploit people of color vote in the electoral vote. Either you come vote for us or you have the right wing. But this time people say, you know, we are not coming, deal with it. So now everybody, even especially white liberals in the United States, are crying out. That's people of color by millions, they didn't vote. The system is not inclusive to me, so whether I vote or not is not an important. I disagree. I think it's very important. And I agree with Hatim that now the Democratic Party, there is 2 tendencies. Keith Allison, which is the first Muslim congressman from Minnesota, and Bernie Sanders, self-proclaimed socialist from Vermont. It's 2 baller within the Democratic Party, and I hope they don't leave, they stay in. And there is the traditional machine, the co-opted, corrupted, corporatized machine of the Democratic Party also existed. So one has to win, because in the last decades, always pro-cooperation, pro-identity politics always win without making any progress in the landscape of social change. I think from what I've been seeing and interacting with, there's a lot of in the social movement, including the most courageous Standing Rock of indigenous people of North Dakota, and the Black Lives Matter, the young people, and the people of different color and multiracial that came into the political scene with very specific demand and extremely aware, socially conscious. They distrust political elite, which is all good, but we have to channel this energy somewhere, and we have to use the electoral politics where it's necessary. For example, I live in California, I live in city of Richmond. The only city of over 100,000 people are not controlled by the Republican nor the Democrats, controlled by Progressive Alliance, include radical ecologists and former Black Panther. People don't know this outside, even in the United States. The politics of Richmond City is extremely progressive. If you brought a Swedes there, they would think this is too progressive for Sweden. It's very, and this is within, the only state tried to challenge even the Constitution of the United States in eminent domain.
Mm-hmm.
So they are very unbelievably progressive and building coalition based on social movement. They rejected both political parties. They said, no, we're going to build our own power. So there is possibility because the United States city politics allow you, the politics from below allow you to create this power and you move forward. Bernie Sanders, he is for the last 30 years, will have over 60% of the vote of people of Vermont, even though he declared himself socialist at that time until recently. So there is a space using electoral politics, but you have to have this strategy and going back and reading, including American or non-American socially, racially conscious, like Malcolm X or Fanon or M.A. Cesar or all these people, and they pointed out to us to create a new, our own new narrative and movement and data and understanding of all the myths around us.
If I can just add something, I think one issue that we're not speaking about, which is very important in the U.S. context, and I agree with almost everything that my colleague has said about the significance of electoral politics, and I think that has certainly been evident within the past year in the context of the U.S. presidential elections and this movement to make sure that as many Muslims as possible register to vote and then actually go and vote on election day, is the role of money. Right? I mean, in the United States, yes, the average citizen is able to wield some form of power on election day by casting a vote, but ultimately politics in America is governed by money. And in the United States, research shows that Muslim Americans are largely middle class and integrated. So far, that may change, depending on what kind of policies we see from the incoming administration and how much worse Islamophobia gets, because three crucial factors that account for the integration of minority populations is language, education, and employment. And so as discrimination worsens, that compromises the integration of minority communities into the majority context. So while we saw, I would say in the United States, this discourse and this movement and emphasis on coalition building and voter registration and making sure Muslims show up on election day, there hasn't been a parallel conversation or movement to emphasize the significance of investing in politics and the political process. And I think that's necessary. The money is there. What we see from the Muslim community is an investment in institutions, and I think that has been the case for the past 10 to 20 years, if not more, in terms of building mosques and building Islamic schools. And I think that the community has been very successful in doing that. And I think there's more of a need for universities and whatnot. We saw that with the emergence of Zaytuna College, for instance, which is wonderful. But also significant for our strategic interest as a Muslim community in the United States is the financial investment in the political process. So, and in addition to that, I'd also say that one of, a hindrance or something that has been impeding the ability of the Muslim Muslim community to overcome Islamophobia. And I think one of the reasons why the phenomenon is worsening is that there's also has been a reluctance or failure to understand the diverse sources of Islamophobia in the American context. I think that there's been a number of research reports about the network of so-called Islamophobes, and it's a multi-million-dollar industry, and that there are key individuals who are ultimately responsible for propagating these discriminatory and harmful narratives. I think that's important and certainly relevant in the context that you presented on with respect to the anti-Sharia legislative movement, even if it's not necessarily termed in that context after the court decision in Oklahoma. But still, there are other sources of Islamophobia in the United States, and until there's an open discussion and recognition of what those sources are, and then a strategic conversation about how to address those sources, we're not going to be able to advance as a Muslim community or even as larger American society, right? And so I think we need to get past just this fixation on the role of these Islamophobes and the Islamophobia network, which I agree, I think they're harmful and it's important, but there are other sources of Islamophobia that we are not speaking about, and I think that's also important as well. And it played out in the context of this past presidential election cycle. So I just wanted to offer